Hello and welcome to the world today. We're going to discuss Italy, an extremely important country on many levels, particularly in politics and culture for most of the last century, produced some of the greatest thinkers of the European left, and the state this country has reached today. Since the evolution that began in the 90s and the latest economic crisis. I have with me in the studio Alberto Toscano, who, apart from teaching critical theory at a university, is the editor of a very powerful collection of books known as the Italian List, published regularly by Seagull Books, a very distinctive publishing house based in Calcutta and Chicago. Alberto, welcome. Thanks. Let me start by putting this to you, that of all the countries in Europe after the Second World War, the Italian left was both the largest and the most influential for a long time, and if we go on from there, produced some of the most distinctive struggles, political and class struggles, in Italy in the 60s and 70s. All that seems to have disappeared. Where do we start? What happened?
Well, the landscape that you see in Italy today, especially in terms of progressive politics, but also progressive culture, is and has been for some time largely a kind of landscape of ruins. So your description is very much pertinent. And not only is it a landscape of ruins or a landscape of failures, but it is also one that's very much dominated by an affect of melancholy, nostalgia, regret, and so on. And the Italian publishing industry, which, even on the left or independent publishing industry, is still surprisingly lively, let's say, seems almost to specialize at the level of critical essays and the like in autopsies, postmortems, of which we've had a lot for the past 20 and 30 years, sociological, intellectual, strategic. So at present, you also have, which I think is worth reflecting upon, the fortunes or the possibilities of any revival of the left blocked in some way or impeded by what some people see as the remnants, the detritus of that tradition, especially of the collapse of the PCI.
If we're discussing the actual history and the trajectory of the PCI as one of the main leaders as a political force of the resistance in Italy. I mean, what is interesting to me is Germany didn't have a resistance, and yet you had a far more far-reaching purge of fascism. Not complete by any means, but in Italy, there was a virtual continuity maintained with the birth of a conservative party. So it's, the question is often raised by people on the far left, but the PCI should have made a revolution. We don't know whether they could or could not have, but what we do know they could have done is to have fought for political hegemony fiercely, given the prestige of the resistance. Instead, they were totally outmaneuvered.
I mean, we can approach that question from a number of angles. One which is of interest is the cultural one, because of course there were a lot of very significant cultural figures of the post-war period, of the immediate post-war period, which the PCI at the level of a kind of cultural hegemony, though I think we should be careful to what extent it really took a Gramscian form, which I think in the end it did not. The Togliattian interpretation and the instrumentalization of Gramsci within the PCI was something else. But within that process, there was a very effective, in some ways, co-option and in a sense, very soft whitewashing of a lot of figures who hadn't been really anti-fascist. And, frankly, of true anti-fascists prior to 43 who were not in exile or hadn't been imprisoned or hadn't been killed under Mussolini, ground was relatively thin. So, in these various processes of trasformismo, or changing one's coat, or turning, turncoats of various sorts, you have a lot of figures who discover themselves, of course, anti-fascists at a later date. After all, we have to remember that when Italian university professors, all Italian university professors, were asked to pledge allegiance to fascist Italy, to Mussolini's government, only 12 refused. There's a famous
12
out of the whole of the Italian university lecturer body. And these are not people who were facing firing squads, or it wasn't even straightforward that they were facing losing their posts. I mean, maybe a high likelihood and so on. So there's also a way, which of course is part of the history of the resistance, that the very concrete and extremely inspiring heroism and also political inventiveness of the resistance, which comes across in a stunning way in a book recently translated by Verso Pavone's A Civil War, which is a really stunning work, that was also combined, especially at the elite, intellectual and professional level, with remarkable levels of continuity. In the 1950s and 60s, when the debate around anti-fascism takes place, and Franco Foltini, one of the authors we've edited and translated for Siegel, writes an essay, one of the few essays, in fact, translated into English. It was translated in the journal Screen in the early 70s, called The Writer's Mandate and the End of Anti-Fascism. And what Foltini is trying to do is trying to precisely diagnose the situation in which an official anti-fascism, embodied in the Constitution, which is, of course, written together by Christian Democrats and communists, as well as figures of the liberal and sometimes radical liberal figures from the Partito d'Azione and so on and so forth, that those values of anti-fascism become official and end up, in some way, closing off, not necessarily revolutionary horizons, as you say, but possibilities for different forms of antagonism that wouldn't involve the kinds of sharing of power, compromise, complicity, which in some ways, if we want to be extremely critical of the tradition of the PCI, and some people have done, especially by seeing how the recent figure of Napolitano is a figure that follows that whole historical arc, we can see a kind of original sin of sorts. At the same time, that also meant that the Italian Communist Party had this strange role of a party on paper and ideologically committed to the full overthrow, abolition, or transformation of bourgeois or capitalist society, which at the same time really identified itself with the state, and really identified itself with the Constitution, so much so that in some ways some of the most honorable and some of the most coherent figures that have come out of, not necessarily straightforwardly the PCI, but in any case that Italian left and communist tradition, have the Constitution as their principal object of political attachment today. While, and this is interesting in terms of the divisions within the Italian left, the new and far left in Italy, as well as that curious entity which was operaismo, Italian workerism, often put its energies into criticizing precisely that figure of the Communist Party as the guardian of the state, the guardian of the rule of law, the guardian of stability.
Let's just come now to culture. That the old communist tradition, Gramsci's obsession with Croce, the that whole tradition, we are descendants of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, that the Italian party, Communist Party, embodied that belief in high culture. And its intellectuals wrote about it endlessly. But when that culture was completely undermined and subverted by the entrance of mass culture on the American model, there was shock and horror, but no way of dealing with it. Berlusconi dealt with it by embracing it and making Italy a model of that culture. They've done it in the States. We can do better than them. And they did. And politically, the follower of that culture was the pale shadow of former leaders of the Italian party, Walter Veltroni, who stood in the big square in the Piazza del Popolo to shout to his people, yes, we can.
The question of culture is a very complex one, I think, in part because one perhaps has to wind the clock back a little to that post-war period that we were talking about and the period of the so-called economic miracle and the period also of the first center-left governments in the early 60s, where you do have, of course, a very strong presence of the Communist Party within the cultural domain, mainly, in some cases, looking into the party with rather Stalinist or Stalinoid modes of controlling its own members, and then extremely tolerant of high-level intellectuals who would sympathize with the Communist Party, who were treated in a
respected,
very accommodating way.
Like the negative philosophy people. Cacciari, for instance, is welcomed into the party, becomes mayor of Venice, whereas Manifesto, who opposed the invasion of Czechoslovakia, challenged it politically, are expelled.
But if we go back to that moment, there is a moment in the 60s, which is, of course, also the moment of the greatest international projection of Italian culture, especially the level of cinema, of course, but also to some extent literature, design, etc., where there is some sense of a distinctively Italian path to or experience of modernity and modernization. You know, in a country which is, of course, still, as one can sense in the more nostalgic moments of Pasolini or even in Antonioni's film, a country that's extremely uneven, especially, of course, if we move towards the center and the south. So on one level, there is already that experience, much as it was during, in a similar period, and the films are remarkably similar in a way in post-war Japan, this experience of American culture and how does one absorb and mobilizes. What's striking then is that, of course, by the time Berlusconi arrives in the scene, late 70s, mainly in the mid 80s, it's not as though you know, Italian culture hadn't encountered various forms of musical and material and commodity invasion, so to speak, from the US. But Berlusconi's rise, of course, takes place in the context of the immense collapse of the energies of the 60s and 70s. So, and very significantly, it's something that percolates in a kind of endemic, molecular way through everyday life. And, you know, generationally speaking, I know this because, you know, if you were a kid in Italy in the 1980s, you know, your television experience or cultural experiences were, you know, not hegemonized in any kind of Gramscian or Togliattian sense, but just permeated in a kind of ambient atmospheric way by a culture over which Berlusconi and his like had a kind of grip. Now, when you get to the 1990s, it's very interesting, having also lived in Italy at that time, that a left or indeed a far left culture with a strange amalgam of a deep-rooted PCI experience, and this is the odd thing about the Fondazione, because it's a point of confluence. It's a rather vibrant culture, and I remember being in high school in Rome in the early 90s, that it was the only culture there was, I mean, aside from very marginal sort of fascist scenes, which now incidentally are huge amongst the youth in Italy, which is extremely worrying, and they've more or less copied the model of the social centers in a far-right mode. At that time, if you were a teenager, that was the cultural world that you were in. It was a world of social movements, of protests, and so on and so forth. And then I guess the question is how to analyze both at the cultural and the political level. What is this, extreme wastage of a kind of social and political capital, which I think Rifondazione and the scene around it did have.
Well, if you look at it now, it's an interesting comparison to be made. A whole layer of young people, not vast in numbers, but nonetheless not insignificant in the impact they had, is that when the PCI finally made its peace officially with the historic compromise and declared publicly, without any room for ambiguity, their loyalty to the Italian state, which had always been there, and asked the Christian Democrats, let's rule together because the Chilean situation means that we must defend democracy against a coup. Now, whatever else there was in Italy, there was never the danger of a military coup d'etat. I don't think the Americans had that in mind for Italy unless there was a revolution. So
there was some local
plotting,
yeah, for sure,
in Bologna and the bombings by fascists in other places, but there was never the danger of a big revolutionary upheaval apart from factory occupations, etc., which you know. But in response to that total merger of the Christian Democrats and the PCI to defend the state, there emerged the Red Brigades. Now, whatever else they were, and they were, in my opinion, totally wrong strategically, tactically, and in every other way, they were part of a phenomenon which developed in all the ex-fascist countries. Japan had a version, Germany had a version, and this was the Italian version. And they said in their writings, everyone is sold out, the only way is to kill. But that was in the 70s. Today, that's the comparison I was going to make, that again there's despondency, people feel all the political parties are by and large the same, it's leading to a growth of the extreme right, but it's also led to the emergence of the five-star movement and the clowns and Beppo Grillo and all this business. It's very Italian for a start, it's very specific to Italy. How would you explain it?
Okay, and we'll bracket the Red Brigades because that would be a very long tale. I think in order to understand the five-star movement and its ongoing, if very peculiar success, I mean, after all, we're talking about the latest polls having it at 27%, which is only 5% under the Partito Democratico, whose latest polls were 32%. With a corollary, though, that the people who vote for it wouldn't want it to govern. This was one of the strangest, but so in that sense, it's really a kind of perfect protest party, almost in the sense that there's a reflexivity on the part of its voters about its role. But to take a step back, I think we have to think of both some political and, so to speak, kind of sociological roots of this. One of them, which we haven't talked about, is the Northern League. Itself a very ambiguous phenomenon, but which drew and continues to draw, because it's had a recent and very disturbing renaissance under this figure, Salvini. It drew the Northern League, and I think in some sense the Movimento 5 Stelle also draws from this, a kind of deep-seated resentment vis-a-vis the state by a whole layer of small professional, broadly speaking, to use somewhat petty bourgeois groups, who had experienced the 80s and 90s as the possibility, which then in a sense turned out to be a mirage, of this kind of post-Fordist efflorescence, the second Italian miracle, especially in the Northeast, but not just. And who then found themselves both with increasing levels of economic and social precarity, but also increasingly feeling themselves to be defrauded by a state which makes very large fiscal demands, which it's true it does, which has extremely high levels of tax evasion, but of course generally by not so petit bourgeois, and whose levels of services and provision are pretty awful in many places. Now, the Grillo phenomenon has been a very strange one. I think it's important also in terms of how we analyze the possibilities and the strategies of the left or the far left, because the Grillo phenomenon has been able to absorb huge amounts of antagonistic and oppositional social energies in ways which I think are ultimately not particularly anti-systemic, which are rather rudderless, and which also have some very suspicious dimensions. Grillo himself having made more than one dodgy comment about migration and about all sorts of different issues, and entering into pacts of sorts with UKIP in Europe. You know, but that said, a lot of genuine oppositional energies, and you see this in some individual MPs for Grillo's party, some of which in fact have left.
Were not two senators expelled for defending the rights of immigrants?
So, so it's a phenomenon that many have seen, commentators on the left in Italy, as having in some sense absorbed and therefore diverted energies which especially in the period immediately after the fall of Berlusconi in this sort of Trichet, Draghi, Monti, Napolitano operation. Yes. In that moment, there was actually an interesting dynamic which involved mass referendum, successful referendum to reverse water privatization and the like. At the time had seen actually good results for fairly anomalous center-left candidates, Pisapia winning in Milan, victories in Cagliari, De Magistris winning in Naples. So there was this kind of moment, a sort of opening of sorts, nothing necessarily massively hopeful, which then was re-channeled into figures which I think in many ways are in a sort of perverse continuity with the phase of Berlusconi or Berlusconismo. Grillo, who comes out of a cultural world which was kind of Berlusconi's world, notwithstanding his opposition to it, and Renzi himself. And at present, you have a strange situation because the Five Star Movement, though present in claims about legality, about corruption, and so on and so forth, and therefore making local victories on this and amassing this kind of capital, has no real political or strategic project necessarily to oppose to Renzi. And it also, around the time of the Napolitano's second presidential anointment and the like, also has missed a lot of opportunities, which is, I think, why some of its members were quite unhappy, some of its representatives missed opportunities to shift the balance of power and wrong foot the Democratic Party.
Just for our viewers, the Democratic Party is the continuation of the old Communist Party, and Renzi, current Prime Minister of Italy, was not elected to power, but appointed, and models himself on Tony Blair.
Yes. Now the PD, whether it's at the point of the PD, we can't, successor is a bit problematic because of course it's also the successor of, in many ways, of the Christian Democrats. Because the Margherita and the Partito Democratico della Sinistra, there was a confluence into and a new foundation of this Democratic Party. And of course, Renzi himself was a young Christian Democrat. So we now have a country that has a prime minister who's an ex-Christian Democrat and a president who's an ex-Christian Democrat. So old joke, we will all die Christian Democrats, which was one of these things that people in Italy used to say in the 60s or 70s or in 80s, and in despair turns out perhaps to be truer than expected. So in any case, I think the Five-Star Movement is, in that sense, a deeply Italian reality. I think in a way, it is truly neither left nor right. And in that sense, it's very different than Podemos's version, which we can discuss at length. But nevertheless, its idea of that as a slogan of radicalism. Instead, I think in the Italian case, it's neither left nor right in the sense of a profound ambiguity. A profound ambiguity, but that nevertheless has what I sense as being the very negative effect of absorbing and framing in this strategically kind of horizonless ways a lot of genuine struggles against corruptions, against the so-called political caste, against the depredation of public services and so on and so forth.
But Alberto, let's say we have when are the next elections in Italy?
Well, so we have a curious situation, as you mentioned, because of course we have a prime minister who's
not elected,
who was never elected, who in fact got into power by unseating through a party coup Letta, who himself wasn't really elected, though he was appointed, by Napolitano after the elections on a kind of grosse coalizione model, which now seems to be a sort of general European model. So technically speaking, the next elections are in 2018. And in the meantime, Renzi, with this majority, which includes shards of Berlusconi's party, Alfano, now this dubious figure, Dennis Verdini, who seems to be also changing his coat and going towards Renzi, is now passing what looks to be a rather abject electoral law in which voters have very little possibility of making decisions on the electoral list. That basically all of the candidates will be sort of appointed from the center, and we're basically seeing also the proposal, which hasn't totally gone through, but the proposal of basically turning the Senate into a fully appointed chamber by regional councils. And including apparently 5 senators who would be directly nominated by the president, which is completely bizarre. And here we have, I think, one of the elements which perhaps has a certain continuity with those discussions about the historic compromise and so on, which is this fetish of stability, which of course links very much to broader European fetishes of financial or budgetary stability. And so the NC really represents this push, which is a push that sees a confluence of left and right onto a presidentialist agenda. You mentioned Veltroni before. Let's not forget that the successors of the Communist Party and the whole Italian center-left has been extremely guilty since the 1990s, if not before, of fetishizing a US political model and of having all sorts of strange delusions about Kennedy or indeed about Obama and so on and so forth, including its own name of Partito Democratico, the Democratic Party, and really seeing the aim of stability as a sort of formal be-all and end-all, which of course I imagine is very attractive to European powers that be, especially because, Renzi, as we saw in the whole Greek imbroglio, is completely supine figure, notwithstanding his, clownish gestures of dissent and so on and so forth.
So, Alberto, to conclude, we have yet another European country in a state of transition, and we don't know how that transition is or when it is going to end. So thank you very much, and we will return to this subject in several months, I'm sure.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us.